I'm Gary Stein, and I want to thank all of you for coming. And what I'm going to do is summarize this report. It's 98 pages. It would take a long time to go through all of it, but I'll try to do the summary based on the executive summary that's in the front. There's a table of contents, and it divides the report into several sections. First, the executive summary. Second, an introduction. Then there's a political context that explains the political atmosphere in Elizabeth over the past 10 years. And there's a long section about the extraordinary educational record of the Elizabeth public school system. And I'll not dwell on the details of that progress, but I'll give you enough of a flavor so you can understand it. Then I'm going to summarize the employee interviews that were conducted by lawyers from Pashman Stein. We interviewed 131 employees of the Elizabeth School District to find out about the accuracy of the allegations in the Star Ledger articles. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about nepotism and tell you what the Star Ledger said about Elizabeth and tell you what the facts are. And then there's a section of the report that deals with the Star Ledger sources. And I explain our conclusion that the Star Ledger had 7 identified sources for their story, and knowingly or unknowingly, every one of those sources was biased against this Elizabeth Board of Education. That bias wasn't disclosed, and the non-disclosure of that bias violated ethical guidelines for journalists that should have been observed. Then there's a recommendation section of the report, and we talk about 2 fundraising events in Elizabeth that we feel were done in a manner that should not be repeated, and we explain why. And then we have our conclusion. So let me start at the beginning, which is that I was hired in June of 2011 by the Elizabeth Board of Education. The reason I was hired was that beginning on May 22nd, 2011, 2 weeks before the Democratic primary election in that year, when there was a very competitive race for the legislature in Union County, in which Senator Lesniak was being opposed, the Star Ledger began a series of articles and editorials. And those articles and editorials alleged that members of the Elizabeth Board of Education consistently pressured employees of the board to contribute to board election campaigns. Now, I've conducted a long, detailed, comprehensive review of those allegations. And I've concluded that the Star Ledger allegations about pressuring employees to donate to board election campaigns are inaccurate, unfair, and unsubstantiated. And as I said before, knowingly or unknowingly, the Star Ledger article relied on 7 identified sources. And I'm going to talk about each one of them to you. But every single one of them had documented adversarial relationships with the board or the superintendent, and the Star Ledger articles and its editorials never disclosed that they had biased sources. Also, the Star Ledger articles never explain that there's been a decade of hostility between Senator Lesniak's political organization, Mayor Bolwich, who's an ally, and the board, and that Senator Lesniak consistently, repeatedly, has been trying to undermine this board by requesting the State Department of Investigation to conduct audits, investigations, monitorings, He and his allies have submitted Oprah requests. He's done everything he could to drag down this school system. As to why he's done it, you'd have to ask him. Also, the Star Ledger articles didn't begin to describe the extraordinary results of this school system over the last 6 years. This school system, one of the poorest and largest urban school districts in the state, has had a spectacular success, and I'll explain a little bit about that. But I think anybody could understand that this board, which is responsible for educating over 23,000 students and spends over $400 million a year, was very concerned that the Star Ledger articles and editorials could undermine the confidence of the parents of the Elizabeth school children. And so the board thought it was very important that they conduct an investigation of these allegations and obtain a report that was objective and independent, and that's what I've tried to do. So let me just summarize very briefly the separate parts of the report. When I talk about the political history, I point out that back in 2006, Elizabeth High School was one of the biggest high schools in the country, suffering from overcrowding. They desperately needed a new high school. They asked the mayor and the city council to help them with the school, and they identified a 9-acre piece of property owned by New Jersey Transit. The mayor said no, that piece of property was going to be redeveloped, and the city council in December 2005 adopted an ordinance to sell that property to a political affiliate of the mayor for $500,000, even though the property was appraised for $5 million. The Elizabeth Board of Education went to court, hired McCarter & English, New Jersey's biggest law firm, and they stopped that sale dead in its tracks. The city council rescinded the ordinance. But as the Star Ledger pointed out in an editorial that they published on April 1, 2006, there was payback by Senator Lesniak, because right after that lawsuit was filed, Senator Lesniak went to the Assembly, went to the Department of Education, and demanded investigations of the Elizabeth Board of Education's finances. And the Star Ledger, in an editorial, said, "It may be that some of the issues raised by Lesniak have merit. What we fear is that this is not about dealing with mismanagement of funds, it's about payback. Lesniak seems to be out to punish the school board, and by extension, the taxpayers of Elizabeth. That's as indefensible as the original multi-million-dollar giveaway." That wasn't all. Not only did he demand investigations by the Department of Education, but he had an ally, a congressman named Robert Andrews from Camden County, whose office is 60 miles away from Elizabeth. Congressman Andrews, for some reason, demanded that the United States Department of Education investigate Elizabeth. And they conducted a 2-year audit of Elizabeth's Title I funds, in the middle of which Mayor Bolwich released a story in the Star Ledger predicting that Elizabeth would have to give $2 million back to the federal government. When all was said and done, it turned out that Elizabeth had to repay $12,000 because it bought some school supplies for some districts that were not within its Title I application. And that kind of harassment has gone on for the last 5 or 6 years. And the Star Ledger article, which focused on how the Elizabeth Board of Education conducted campaigns and how employees volunteered to help and took sick time to help, never said a word about this atmosphere of hostility between Senator Lesniak, Mayor Bolwich, and the board. And so they never even began to describe this adversarial atmosphere under which this board and this superintendent had to work. There were very hard-fought election campaigns in 2007, 2008, 2011, and in none of those campaigns were candidates supported by Senator Lesniak elected. As recently as this past December, at a meeting of education watchdogs, an anti-Board of Education organization, Senator Lesniak stood up, urged the crowd to help him defeat the members of the Elizabeth Board of Education, and then thanked City Council member Frank Cuesta for introducing him, and said that Mr. Cuesta would be the next superintendent of the Elizabeth Board of Education. We'll talk a little bit more about Mr. Cuesta, who the Star Ledger editorial describes as an authoritative source and relies on Mr. Cuesta's observations. You know, I might even just read a little bit from that editorial written on May 23rd. It starts like this: "The foul odor in Elizabeth these days cannot be blamed on oil refineries along the turnpike. It is from the ethical rot created by the city's Board of Education." And the editorial goes on and says, "Several authoritative sources, including a former superintendent, Tom Dunn, whom the board fired, and a former principal, Frank Cuesta, say that is precisely what happens. You're shut out of the system if you don't donate money." An ugly, harsh, unfair, distorted editorial. Let me tell you what this school system has done during the past 6 years. Test scores for grades 3 through 8 and grade 11. Those are the grades tested on the state standard tests. Elizabeth Public Schools in every grade have improved every year in language arts and mathematics. In addition, the state groups schools based on wealth. So Elizabeth is in the district factor group A, along with 37 other low-income communities. In every year since 2005, Elizabeth's ranking on the state tests compared to those other 37 communities have gone up. For example,